Welcome to another episode of It Takes a Viking, the official podcast of the Salem State University Alumni and Friends community. My name is Mike Mitchell, Director of Engagement here at Salem State. Excited to welcome a member of the class of 2023, a veteran of the United States Armed Forces, Mr. David Nicastro. David, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. It's good to be with you again.
It's my pleasure. My gratitude for your service, my love for your story and all the great work that you're doing now is endless. So I'm really excited to share it with everybody. But the first question I always ask everyone that joins us is, what brought you to Salem State and how did you end up here?
Yeah, wow. I ended up doing 23 years in multiple uniforms for the country, for our country and the state. I was a state trooper during that time, and my mental stuff really started coming through. I was struggling at that point in my life, transitioning from all that time in the military and war zones to even be a civilian state trooper. And ultimately, there was a crash in there, a mental crash, a struggle. And I had been connecting with the VA for my mental health. And we identified I couldn't carry a gun for a living. I couldn't be in uniform anymore. So we brainstormed, well, what's next? And there's a program in the VA for them to rehabilitate men in uniform. And I went that way. And it's called Chapter 31, Vocational Rehabilitation. And at that point, we looked at psychology. This part of me wanted to know why my brain was capable and why it did what it did to survive everything, even civilian life. I chose Salem State because it's got a really nice psychology program, and you have many alumni who had told me that as well. And it seemed to be the program as a Viking to learn the whys in community of why the brain did what it did. And I was a sponge. I was a sponge in psychology here. It was amazing.
And one of the pieces that's probably a little atypical from other guests that we've talked to is that usually other folks that I'm talking with have had some time outside of their Salem State experience, maybe a decade or so. You're obviously a very new graduate, very recent graduate. The work that you've been doing, I know, has started since prior to your graduation, but, with Amira, for example, and we'll get into all of that, but you've got this robust body of work. In addition to your time in the service, you're doing the veterans healing circles and the programs there and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about some of that work that you've been doing and why it was important to you to get involved?
Yeah, and I did the anti-trafficking organization I'm a part of, as well as the Veterans of War Retreat Centers. I was there before Salem State, but Salem State provided the language. Even this most recent one, this past weekend, I was able to articulate to the veterans their burnt out circuit board, their allostatic load of a brain that can't function because of the cycle of trauma that they're stuck in. And I was using psychology terms I learned in the program here at Salem State. But not only that, I lived it. I lived with those terms. I was in war zones and stuck and was in a cycle for so long. And so even though those organizations I was a part of, Salem State helped kind of bridge that gap and put it together. So I'm able to use the terms and explain it to the veterans in a psychology way. Because sometimes they're such thinkers and we outthink ourselves that they needed a man who's been through it, who can also explain it and put it in terms that they would understand. So it's just like, it was a perfect storm of trauma that led me to come here. And Salem State was that piece. I needed the language and I needed to know why so I could help put back the circuit board the way it was created. And Salem State, in the 4 years I was here in that degree, was integral to my healing. I needed all of it, but really the psychology degree here really put it together for me. And it's allowed me to help so many other people in my organizations I'm a part of now and provide language, because we sit there with no language. We are in such a cycle of trauma, from suicidal ideology, pain, depression, despair, you name the emotion, we have it. And we don't have the words to express the manifestations of physical pain. And the psychology program helped me have language to explain what's going on inside. And the men hear it and the women hear it. And they're going, yes, that's it, what he just said, all over the place. And I'm just so grateful. They loved me with grace here at this place. My professors, I was very quick to tell them I was a veteran of multiple wars, very complex trauma history from childhood all the way up to my stuff in the civilian life. and they worked with me and loved me to help me go deeper into my healing. They always helped me write my papers based on my experience, but that it's still connected to what we were learning in the class. And I just, everything from, the veterans organization here to the disability department, everybody worked with me to put together just a great packet or program or class each semester. And ultimately graduating, I now take it into the field with me, into the trenches, as I say. Yeah.
In a previous conversation we had, you had raised something that I thought was interesting that I don't think a lot of people would consider, in that, you're a dad of 3 young kids, right? And not only in the daily kind of challenges of working through mental health, potential crises and things like that, but something that you learned while you were here was that as human beings and as creators of younger life forms, some of those lived traumas can be passed on.
That's right.
Inadvertently, unintentionally,
Yeah.
and that program helped you kind of conceptualize that and work through that a little bit.
My last class was a clinical psychology class on the epigenetics, which is the passing down of DNA and fibers to future generations. And there are studies that 2nd, 3rd, and 4th generations will feel the effects of the trauma of when you conceive. It's all in there, the anxiety, the fear. And there are many of us walking around that have trauma from 2 to 3 generations past, plus the traumas we have. And you just add that up, we pass it down to our kids. And the example that Mike is using is my daughter will lay in bed some nights, and she's young, and she doesn't know why she's crying, and she doesn't know why she feels deep fear or despair or depression. And she hasn't been through a ton of trauma. And she's able to tell me the exact way I was feeling at war. And at that time, I couldn't feel fear. Even though I did, I had to flip a switch and get through missions. And here my daughter is telling me how I feel or how I felt in Iraq and Afghanistan during that time. So again, it put together epigenetics. It's real. And I'm able to hug her, love her, give her language for the internal pain, and tell her, that's okay. You're not alone. Give me a hug. And I say to her, I'm sorry. This one gets me, man. I'm able to tell my kids I'm sorry for what I went through, and that I did pass it down to them. And we worked through it together. She's in art therapy, and we just have to work through this stuff together. You heal in community. You don't hide. You don't isolate. I've had to heal in community. I'm not doing it alone. And my kids will not go through it alone, because I want to break the cycle of trauma, pain, depression, despair that our parents and grandparents couldn't do. I don't want my kids to go through what I went through. Or if they're going to go through it, I'm going to tell them they're okay. They're not alone, and we're going to do it together.
And that's such a, as you just referenced, our parents and grandparents that may have been members of the armed services or having experienced traumatic incidents themselves. I think the advancement of the mental health spectrum, even just over the last 25 years, since our generation went off to Iraq and Afghanistan, and there's obviously a much deeper understanding of it now, and an acceptance of it, and a willingness to help others that are feeling it, as opposed to maybe our parents or grandparents' generation who were just told, toughen up.
That's right.
You'll get over it.
The World War generation, right? They call it the greatest generation, World War II. They won a war. They came home with the high of winning a war. There was still a lot of trauma, but they got put into the workforce and they had this purpose. So I hear the Vietnam veterans and other veterans telling me about the World War veterans. They still struggled. Vietnam was a different animal because they lost their war. They came home to a country that didn't appreciate them and love them. This generation, the Vietnam generation, not only passed down their trauma to generations, they had to live it daily with a country that didn't love them the way they needed to be loved. Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, at least we learned from Vietnam. So there was a type of mental health there, but a 20-year war creates 2.5 million veterans coming home from war with a struggle with mental health. And the resources, the VA is good, but they weren't ready for 2.5 million veterans, not the number of veterans coming home. So a lot of us that went to the VA looked at us with the struggles I had, said, we can't help with the long-term treatment. So I was able to advocate and get help to find private sector treatment. And so for the veterans or anyone with mental health, you have to have a voice to advocate that I got to be different. I can't live like this. and get out there and keep searching. I went through 6 or 7 therapists until I found myself at my final trauma therapist. Not final in the sense that this is it. I received so many different types of therapies, but she was the one that opened up the hardest boxes of my traumas and memories, and we worked on it in depth together for 4.5+ years.
Let's shift gears for just a second, because obviously as a survivor and thriver of trauma yourself, helping others to get through their traumas through your veterans healing circles, as if that weren't enough, you touched on it very briefly earlier, Amira, Genesis Israel.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the work you're doing with those organizations, because I think it's important to highlight that. I think the best way to say it at this point, and having known you as long as I have and what you've done, is that you're a servant leader. You know, you see the value in service and giving of yourself to others. And so Genesis Israel is one piece. Amira is another. But can we dive into those a little bit?
Sure. Amira is an anti-trafficking organization here in the North Shore, Boston area. We're there to rehome women and give them a new life out of trafficking, exploitation, and those prostituted. I do have a servant heart. It's why I went into the Marine Corps. It's why I continued to do 23 years in uniform, because I was meant to help those who are crushed, oppressed, downtrodden. And Amira was that place. As I was transitioning out of the state police, what's my purpose? What's my next step? And Amira fell into place. It's interesting because I was one of very few men that had access. And I think when I went in for my training, they recognized a man with post-traumatic stress. As they were teaching me, again, it was language. I'm like, as they went over post-traumatic stress of the women, I was like, yes, 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 about myself. And those who have been to war and trafficking victims, we haven't been through the same war trauma, right? Their war is so different, but the physical and emotional manifestations are almost identical. So the way it comes into our head and the way we feel it in our body. So I connected with the survivors on that sense. And when I worked in the home with them, we bonded in that sense, where they would say, we don't know one good man, and I represented a type of man to them that they needed to know as they went through their healing process. And for me and my trauma, I watched women, because I'd been exposed to men my whole life. My earthly father had 5 brothers. There's 5 of us in my family. I was never raised around women. So being raised in a home, if you will, during my shift around women, watching them panic, watching them trigger, watching them cry, and learning how as a team to come around them and love them, healed me too. The women inside those homes healed me. The overflow, it was back and forth. It was reciprocal. You heal in community. So that was the anti-trafficking world, and I still work there now. When we find a woman at Amira that needs to be removed from that situation, the staff are women that work with the women. The clinical staff is amazing, because men are the problem in the world when it comes to most of it's men that are the problem with trafficking, exploitation, and those prostituted. So the women are like special operators now. How about that? The reverse of it. I worked in special organizations in the military. The women are now the special operators in the field. So they find a woman, they rehome them, they call me and a few safe men, and we provide the resources like furniture, box truck, and we move to that location and we rehome the woman so they can begin their 2 to 3 year journey of starting a new life. And we're just part of that initial process to physically get them their new home. And that's Amira. And that mission is dear to my heart. Genesis Israel, Genesis meaning the beginning. It's out of the Bible, Genesis, the first of. And Israel, obviously everyone knows Israel. Where I've recently just come back from Israel in May, and it's a war zone. So it's this, once gone into war zones in the Middle East, and I've been hurt by that. I wasn't carrying a gun. I didn't have a uniform. I was a different type of man. I was meant to go on the ground and be exposed to a lot of the stories and atrocities so I could have compassion and love, and then bring those stories back to share it with people. And I know Mike had shared that's a podcast that he had kind of watched and seen that story. And I was meant to just sit there, listen to the trauma, hear their hearts, and then come home and tell the story. And I'm being called back as well. So just a different different type of lifestyle, different type of warrior, if you will, but all of it's service work at this point. It's all service work. So
Even though, as I mentioned, you have a servant heart, no question about it. There can still be some tough days for you, I'm sure,
Yeah.
How are you, what kind of steps do you take when you recognize that you might be having a day? How are you taking care of yourself? How are you making sure that, the needs of others, but also yourself are well taken care of?
Yeah, because that initial trigger or emotion can send our brain to a rabbit hole, and by 2, 3, or 4 thoughts, you already feel you're exploding physically, right? The fight, flight, or freeze, or your brain's going back into memories, or you're anxious about future memories. I've gotten better at 1 or 2 thoughts that might trigger me at just taking a deep breath and slowing down, thinking about the road to get here, and that usually a trigger represents you have work to do on a previous memory. So really try to, why am I feeling this way right now? Why is my heart rate up? Why am I feeling a physical pain in my body? Why is my brain going 100 miles a minute? And I just have to slow down. And I usually have a safe circle of people that I want to process this with. Just they help me slow down, and they're obviously not going through what I'm going through. I do physical healing as well. I still have therapy. I have massage therapy on certain points of my body that help. I've received chiropractic work for certain injuries I have. I have acupuncture work that works on some of my stuff. And I notice in all of these, there's some mental stuff going on as well, and all of my physical stuff. As I lay on a table and I'm receiving physical work, I'm like, okay, so what's going on? And I'm noticing emotions or memories coming up. It's just absolutely fascinating how, with all of the training and life experience, it's like it's being worked out of me.
Yeah.
And friends help me expose it as well. If it's so triggering, like this past weekend at a Veteran of War retreat, I was exploding, because you're meant to at a retreat. You're meant to open the boxes of trauma. One of my worst traumas popped up in my face, and I didn't know it was there, except for a man told a story that triggered me back to my story, and it opened up the box of trauma. And I had to get with a guy and confess it to him and expose the darkness. Other men came around me to hear my story, and just sharing it and breaking down through the waters of my eyes, the box opened up and the floodgates opened up, and I just was bawling, because at that point in my life, I couldn't bawl. It wasn't the time or the space. I was surviving. And I literally at this point had to heal from that time in my life. And it happened 5 years after the point. I was there in a room this past weekend having to heal from a memory. And I noticed when I open up one memory, 3 or 4 are right there behind it popping open. So it's a floodgate thing. When you're ready to heal, when you're ready to drop the addiction, you're ready to heal in your life, and you expose the trauma, there are other traumas or memories right there ready to open up. And I have a community that's ready to hear me. And that's kind of the work I do too. I'm ready to hear other people. So I know I can't take on other people's stuff. I hear it. And at this point in my life, because I am compassionate and empathetic, I bring that to other people, and I want to express it, so I'm not holding other people's stuff. It's hard enough holding my own stuff.
Sure.
So I got to give it to other people to take from me. And it's kind of a healthy cycle of coping and the tools I've been given. So,
And if there's a veteran out there who's watching that says, you know what, I'm identifying with a lot of what he's saying right now, where can they learn more about your retreats or other work that you're doing to maybe
I would love for them to personally connect with me.
Okay.
The veterans are on a spectrum at this point, because they're no longer in that purpose of a military uniform and service. And we're struggling to find our purpose in civilian life. And we tend to isolate and hide and get addicted and can't communicate. And so this cycle or this spectrum of suicidal, right? I got to end it, to homicidal. We've been trained to use weapons and kill. And some of us have been exposed at war to that stuff. In between that spectrum is everything else, from darkness and the lies of I'm unworthy, I failed in my marriage, I failed as a father, I failed as a man or a woman, and we're addicted, we're trying to numb in all the unhealthy ways. So we are struggling. And there are resources out there, plenty of resources. Bridging the Gap Vets podcast is the one that I do. We provide those resources. We would connect you to your local veterans rep. We would connect you to the VA. because ultimately we need community. We can't hide anymore. We can't isolate. We can't numb with booze, lust, another body in bed. We can't numb with drugs, whatever the addictive, unhealthy coping mechanism is. We want to break that cycle and establish new disciplines. Just like the discipline in the military, you got to wake up at 5:30, make your rack, most basic one. Wake up in the morning, make your bed, put your feet on the ground, and let's start to establish disciplines and steps throughout the day to find new purpose. And that's kind of the resources we would identify as the most fundamental, is like hygiene and making your bed. Because some of us just lay in bed for hours sitting in that filth. And it gets comfortable after a while, filth. But we're trying to break that mold and just move forward with positive steps. So we will find you the resources. The local veterans rep loves you. The veterans who know what you're going through love you, because we've been there and we still struggle. And you have to heal in community. We can't do it alone. We can't do it alone.
If you could go back in time and change, would you change any decisions that you made that led you to this place, or do you still feel like it was all for a reason and you're on your right path now?
Yeah, my life has been really painful. When I can look back at it now, and if you had told me I was to go through it and you would help many people, I would say no, it's been too painful. But I also recognize I can't change anything either, because when you're looking at a survivor of trafficking or a veteran who's about to take his life, there are certain language I use or certain things I'd say that lets them know I don't know everything you've gone through. I can't identify with you 100% because I'm not you, but I want you to know you're not alone. And when I start to explain, if I'm meant to explain even my testimony in that place, they can hear the language and say, yeah, this guy gets it. And I go, I'm not the only one. You do have a lot of people in your circle, or people I can just connect you with that feel the same way. So no, I wouldn't change anything. And there's a lot of trauma in my life, only because I'm in places now where my peer support overflows onto them and they can heal. And I'm telling you, when I watch them take steps in the right direction, it helps me heal too. When I watch people get healed, or I watch people start to break out of that cycle, I get the overflow of their healing, and we get lifted up together. So it's the community of peer support and healing in community is beautiful for the healer and the one being healed. It's together. They're interlinked.
It's powerful.
It's powerful. Yeah, absolutely. It takes us to new heights and new levels. Yeah.
You and I indirectly first met during your senior year. You had applied for a senior award. I think you had received a scholarship while you were here at the school too. I remember reading your application going, this is a guy I gotta meet.
Yes.
He is doing some good work. And having met you, watched you graduate, seeing you continue this incredible work that you're doing, I'm honored, thrilled, so proud that I can call you a friend and that you are one of ours here at Salem State. I just want to thank you for the incredible work that you're doing in service to others, for your service to the nation as a veteran, and now for your service to the nation's veterans as well. David, I know you're an extraordinarily busy guy, so I appreciate you taking the time to join us today to help share your testimony on kind of your path to self-improvement and better mental health and advocacy and all the good things that you're doing. We're just truly, truly grateful to you.
I'm grateful for you. And I just remember that time too. I saw you at everything. It was 5, 6, or 7 different ceremonies, and you were always there. I kept shaking your hand, going, this guy is everywhere. So reconnecting with you has been amazing, and I just want to keep this up and keep this going.
Yeah, and I know for sure we'll always be watching what you're doing and the great things that are happening under your care. So, David Nicastro, thank you so much for your time and joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you to everybody watching. It's been another episode of It Takes a Viking, the official podcast of the Salem State University alumni and friends community. Until next time, my name is Mike Mitchell. Thanks for watching.